When I first heard that my son Michael was getting serious about a young woman named Clara, my heart filled with both joy and quiet worry. Every mother dreams of seeing her child loved and happy, but deep inside there is always that tiny fear of the unknown. I had never met Clara or her family, and I didn't know what kind of people they were. Michael spoke about her with warmth, saying she was kind and thoughtful, but I could tell there was something he wasn't saying, something that made him hesitate whenever I asked about meeting them. One evening while we were having dinner, he said, "Mom, I think it's time you met Clara's parents. They want to invite us for lunch this weekend." I smiled and said, "That sounds lovely, Michael." But he shifted in his chair, looked down at his plate, and said, "Mom, I just want to warn you, her family is a bit proud. They care a lot about status, money, appearances, that kind of thing." I laughed softly and said, "Then they'll be disappointed meeting me because I've never been much good at pretending." But that night after he went to bed, I sat by the window thinking I had worked all my life as a nurse raising Michael alone after his father passed away. We didn't have much, but we always had enough. I had never been ashamed of living simply because everything we owned came from honesty and hard work. Still, I knew how some people could be, how they looked at you differently when they thought you were ordinary or poor, and for some reason I felt a pull inside me, a quiet whisper saying, "Let them think what they want." That weekend I dressed in my oldest coat, one that I still wore when gardening. I tied my hair back simply, no jewelry, no makeup, just myself, plain and true. When Michael saw me, he frowned and said, "Mom, you don't have to dress like that." I smiled and said, "Let's just say I want to meet them as myself, not as who they expect me to be." He sighed but didn't argue. The drive to Clara's family home was long. Their house stood tall on a hill, surrounded by wide gates and trimmed hedge. It was the kind of place that looked beautiful, but somehow cold. Michael looked nervous as we pulled into the driveway. He said quietly, "Please don't take anything they say personally. They can be, well, judgmental." I touched his hand and said, "Don't you worry, son. I've met harder people in my life than the kind who judge by clothes." Clara greeted us at the door. She was lovely, polite, and nervous. Her parents stood behind her, the kind of couple who wore confidence, like a coat. Mr. Peterson shook my hand lightly, his eyes scanning my coat and shoes. Mrs. Peterson smiled, a thin smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She said, "Oh, you're Michael's mother. How nice to finally meet you." I could almost hear the unspoken words hiding behind her tone. We sat in their grand dining room, the table covered with fine dishes, gold-rimmed plates, and glasses that sparkled under the chandelier. I looked around, quietly admiring how beautiful it all was, but feeling a chill in the air. Mr. Peterson began asking questions in that polite yet pointed way people sometimes do. "So, Mary, what do you do?" he asked. I smiled and said, "Oh, I'm retired now. I used to work at a hospital." He nodded slowly and said, "Oh, a nurse, I see. That must have been stable." I nodded. It was enough for us. Then Mrs. Peterson leaned forward with a smile that felt more like curiosity than kindness. She said, "And your husband, what does he do?" I paused for a moment and said softly, "He passed away many years ago. I raised Michael on my own." Her eyes flickered for a moment and she said, "Oh, that must have been difficult." I smiled again and said it had its moments, but we managed. Throughout lunch, I could feel their glances, the quiet judgment hiding behind polite smiles. I didn't let it bother me. I just kept listening, smiling, thanking them for the meal. I spoke, gently asked them about their travels, their favorite books, their garden. I wanted them to see that I wasn't here to impress anyone. I was here because my son loved their daughter, and that was enough for me. After lunch, while Clara showed Michael around the garden, Mrs. Peterson invited me to sit with her on the patio. She said, "You must be very proud of your son. He's doing quite well for someone from a modest background." I looked at her kindly and said, "Yes, he's my greatest blessing." She sipped her tea and said, "Clara told me he bought his own house. That's quite ambitious for his age." I nodded. "He's worked hard for everything he has." She smiled slightly and said, "Well, that's good. He'll fit in just fine here. Something in the way she said fit in made me feel a little ache in my chest, as if she thought my son needed to earn his place in their world, but I stayed quiet. There was no anger, only a gentle sadness. I thought how often people mistake wealth for worth. When Michael and I left that afternoon, he asked me in the car, "So what did you think?" I smiled and said, "They're nice in their own way." He sighed, "Mom, I could tell you didn't like them." I laughed softly and said, "No, son, I didn't say that. They just have a errant way of seeing life." He looked at me puzzled and said, "You're taking this better than I thought." I looked out the window at the sunset and said, "Sometimes the best thing you can do is let people show you who they are before you decide how to respond." What he didn't know was that the moment I shook Mr. Peterson's hand, I already knew what I was going to do. I wanted to see if Clara and her family truly cared about Michael for who he was, not for what they thought he could give them. I had been poor once, yes, but life had changed years ago in quiet ways that no one around here knew. I had saved, worked and invested, and now lived comfortably. I just never told anyone because peace mattered more than pride. That night, as I sat in bed, I smiled to myself, thinking sometimes pretending to be small is the best way to see who looks down on you tomorrow. Would tell me a lot more about who these people really were. The next morning, Michael called me early. His voice sounded light, happier than the day before. He said, "Mom, Clara told me her parents really liked you." I smiled softly and said, "That's good, son." I'm glad. He paused for a moment and added, "But Mom, there's something else. They invited us to dinner again this weekend." I could hear the hesitation in his voice, and before he even said it, I knew why. He continued, "They said they want to get to know you better and maybe talk about the engagement." I agreed, of course, even though a part of me still felt that uneasy feeling from the first visit. I knew there was more behind their polite smiles, something I couldn't quite name yet, but I told myself patience reveals everything. The week passed slowly. I spent my days tending to my small garden, baking bread, and reading by the window every now and then. My thoughts drifted to Clara. I wondered what kind of life she had lived, surrounded by people who valued wealth above warmth. I hoped her heart was gentler than her parents'. Manners, she seemed kind, but there was something guarded about her eyes, like a person on between two worlds. On Saturday, I dressed simply again, but this time I chose a soft blue dress, the one I had worn at Michael's graduation. It was plain, but neat, comfortable, and filled with good memories. When Michael saw me, he said, "You look lovely, Mom. Are you sure you don't want to wear something fancier?" I smiled and said, "No, dear. Let them see me just as I am. The truth doesn't need decoration." When we arrived at the Petersons' home this time, they seemed a little more relaxed. There was laughter in the air, but still that subtle edge in their tone. Mrs. Peterson greeted us warmly, then led me to the living room where a few relatives had gathered. I noticed the quick glances, the quiet whispers people give when they try to judge someone in a moment. During dinner, the conversation turned to wedding plans. Mrs. Peterson spoke of venues and caterers and photographers in a tone that sounded more like business than joy. Then she looked at me and said, "Mary, we were thinking perhaps we could host the engagement party at our country club. It's such a lovely place." I smiled politely and said, "That sounds beautiful, dear." She nodded, pleased, then added, "We'd be happy to handle the expenses, of course, since you might not be able to contribute much financially." The table went silent for a second. Michael froze his fork halfway to his mouth. Clara's eyes widened a little. I felt my heart sting, but I kept my calm. I looked at her and said softly, "That's very generous of you, but please don't worry. I'll take care of my part." She blinked, surprised, as if she hadn't expected me to answer so gently. After dinner, when we were leaving, Clara walked me to the car. She seemed embarrassed. She said quietly, "Mary, I'm so sorry about what my mother said. She doesn't mean to sound that way. She just talks without thinking." I smiled and said, "It's all right, dear. Some lessons life teaches too late and some never at all." She sighed and said, "I really do love Michael. I don't care about money or class or any of that. I just want you to know that I believe you, Clara." I said softly, "Time always tells what the heart is made of." That night at home, I sat in my rocking chair thinking about everything. I wasn't angry. I was sad more than anything because I had seen this before long ago when I was young and first married to Michael's father. His parents had looked at me the same way they had judged my simple dress, my hands rough from work, my quiet voice. But life has a way of turning those judgments into lessons you never forget. I looked at an old photograph on my wall of my younger self, holding baby Michael, smiling in front of our tiny apartment. That woman had nothing but dreams and courage, and now, years later, I had more than enough. I owned 2 houses, one where I lived quietly and one that I rented out. I had savings, investments, and a heart that no longer cared for showing off. I smiled to myself, thinking they think I am poor, but one day they will learn that richness isn't in what you wear, it's in what you give. The next week, Clara came to visit me alone. She looked nervous, holding a small box of pastries in her hands. She said, "Mary, I wanted to come by and talk." She sat on the couch and said, "My parents mean well, but they care too much about appearances. They don't understand that love doesn't always come dressed in luxury." I looked at her kindly and said, "You have a good heart, Clara. But life will test that sometimes people will push you to choose between what's right and what's easy." She nodded and said, "I just hope Michael never feels ashamed of where he comes from." I took her hand and said, "If he ever does, remind him that his strength came from struggle, not wealth." We spent that afternoon talking about simple things, the kind of real talk women share. When they stop pretending, I saw something change in her eyes that day, a small spark of understanding, like she finally saw me not as the poor old mother of her fiancé, but as a woman who had lived, learned, and endured. When she left, I stood by the window watching her car disappear down the street. I whispered quietly to myself, she might just be the one after all. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't over. Life has a way of testing hearts in unexpected ways, and soon something would happen that would reveal everyone's true colors, including mine. A few weeks later, Clara's parents hosted a large engagement dinner at their country club, just as they had planned. They sent out invitations to all their friends, the kind who always dressed in glitter and spoke in half smiles. Michael was excited, but I could tell he was nervous too. He wanted everything to go well. He said, "Mom, please try to look your best tonight. I know they are particular." I smiled and said, "Don't worry, dear. I will look like myself, and that will be enough." That afternoon, I took out a simple cream-colored dress. It wasn't expensive, but it was elegant and soft. I brushed my hair, tied it neatly, and wore a small golden locket that Michael had given me on Mother's Day. Long ago, when I looked in the mirror, I saw a man who had lived through storms, but still carried light in her eyes. When we arrived, the place was filled with laughter and music. The room glittered with chandeliers and perfume. But beneath all that shine, I could feel the invisible lines that divided people. Clara ran to greet me. She looked beautiful and a little anxious. She whispered, "You look perfect, Mary. Thank you for coming." Her sincerity touched me. As dinner began, Mr. Peterson stood and made a small speech about love and family and how happy they were to welcome Michael into their circle. I smiled politely, but I could sense something rehearsed in his tone. Then came the moment that changed everything. Mrs. Peterson leaned forward and said loudly enough for others to hear, "Mary, dear, I hope you don't mind, but we'd love to know what you do for a living. We never quite understood your background." The room went quiet. Michael's face turned pale. Clara looked horrified. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. I smiled calmly and said, "I'm retired now. Boo. I used to manage a small business." She raised her eyebrows and said, "Oh, really? What kind of business?" I said I owned a small property management company, mostly rentals and maintenance. Nothing big, but it kept me busy. Her tone softened slightly as she said, "Oh, how interesting." Michael looked relieved, but Mrs. Peterson wasn't done. She continued, "I hope you don't mind me asking, dear, but how does one retire from a small business so early? I still work full-time." You know, I chuckled softly and said I worked hard for many years and I made wise choices along the way. I've been fortunate. The man sitting next to her, her brother, I think spoke up with a smirk. Well, it's always good to be practical when you don't have much to fall back on. I looked at him and said gently, "You're right, sir. Practicality builds more peace than wealth ever could." The table went silent again, and then the conversation shifted to something else. After dinner, Clara found me in the hallway near the ladies' room. She looked upset and said, "I'm so sorry, Mary. I don't know why they have to speak like that." I said, "It's all right, dear. Some people are just afraid of what they don't understand." She asked quietly, "Why do you let them talk down to you? You could tell them everything about your success." I shook my head and said, "Because kindness teaches more than pride ever could." Later that evening, something unexpected happened as we were leaving. An elderly woman approached me. She was quiet and gentle, and she said softly, "I remember you, Mary. You may not recall, but years ago you helped me find a place to live when my husband passed away. You even refused to take a fee." I was stunned. It was Mrs. Donnelly, an old tenant from my early business days. She smiled warmly and said, "I told them all back then you were an angel." Clara overheard the conversation, and her eyes widened. She said, "Mary, you did that." She looked amazed. Mrs. Donnelly nodded and said, "Oh, yes, dear, she's the kindest woman I've ever met. She even fixed the leaking pipes herself when no Ned would come." When Mrs. Donnelly walked away, I saw the look on Clara's face. It was a mix of admiration and guilt. She whispered, "I knew you were humble, but I didn't know you were this strong." I smiled softly and said, "Sometimes strength hides in silence, dear." The ride home that night was quiet. Michael held my hand the whole way. He didn't need to say anything. I could feel his pride in the way he looked at me when we reached home. He said, "Mom, thank you for tonight. I know it wasn't easy." I said, "It's never easy, son, but the truth never needs to shout." A few days later, Clara came by again. This time she brought a notebook full of wedding ideas, but before we even opened it, she said, "Mary, can I ask you something? Why did you act poor the first time you met my parents? You could have shown them who you are, what you've built." I took a breath and said, "Because I needed to know who they were before I showed them who I am." She looked thoughtful and said, "That's powerful." She smiled and added, "I hope one day I can be as brave as you." I told her courage doesn't always come with loud choices. Sometimes it comes with quiet tests. The way people treat you when they think you have nothing reveals who they truly are. She nodded slowly, as if she finally understood. But the real test was still ahead. Something was about to happen that would force the truth out in the open, and it would change the way everyone saw me forever. A week later, Clara called me early in the morning. Her voice sounded tense. She said, "Mary, I don't know how to say this, but there's some confusion about the wedding finances. My parents think maybe you can't contribute and they want to take control of everything." I could hear the guilt in her tone. I asked her calmly, "What kind of confusion, dear?" She sighed and said, "They asked Michael last night if you could afford your part of the expenses. And when he said you were handling things in your own way, they assumed that meant you didn't have money and were embarrassed to admit it." I took a slow breath and said, "That's all right, Clara. Let them believe what they wish. I don't owe anyone an explanation," she said. "But Mary, they're spreading it around to relatives. It's becoming talk in the family." I closed my eyes and said quietly, "Sometimes people expose their hearts without even realizing it. Let them talk. Dear, truth always finds its way home." Later that afternoon, I got a call from Michael. He sounded upset. "Mom, did you talk to Clara's parents?" I said, "Not yet, dear." Why? He sighed and said, "They're saying they might have to postpone the wedding until things are clear about finances." I could hear the frustration in his voice. He said, "I told them I don't care about money, but they said it's about family reputation." I said calmly, "Don't worry, son. Let's go visit them tonight. I'll clear everything once and for all." That evening we drove to their home. The air felt heavy. Clara opened the door, her face pale with worry. Mrs. Peterson sat in the living room, her posture stiff. Mr. Peterson was standing by the window with a serious look. I greeted them politely and said, "Thank you for seeing us." Mrs. Peterson smiled tightly and said, "Of course, Mary. We just thought it's best to discuss everything openly before things go further." I nodded and said, "I agree. Honesty makes everything easier." She looked at me and said, "I hope you understand we only want the best for Clara. She's been raised with certain expectations. We just don't want her to face hardship." I said gently, "I understand your concern, but I think hardship is not measured by money, but by lack of love and respect. She shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Peterson said, I think what my wife means is that marriage requires stability and financial security. Michael mentioned you've retired already and we're not sure how much support you can provide. I looked at both of them and said, I see, so you worry that I may not be able to afford my share. They nodded quietly. I smiled softly and said, fair enough. I reached into my small handbag and took out a folded paper. I laid it on the table. It was a property deed. Then another and another. Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened. I said, these are the titles of the homes I own. One of them is the house I live in. The other 3 are rented out. The income from those supports me comfortably. I also have investments I manage myself. I looked at them gently and said, I never mentioned this before because I wanted you to see me, not my possessions. For a moment the room went silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock. Mrs. Peterson's face turned red. She said quietly, I didn't realize. I said, that's all right. You weren't supposed to. You see, people treat you differently when they think you're poor. That's how you learn their true nature. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She said softly, Mary, I had no idea. I said, that's because I didn't want anyone to know. At first, I needed to be sure that my son was marrying a woman who loved him for who he is, not for what he might inherit. Michael took my hand and whispered, Mom, you didn't have to do that. I smiled at him and said, sometimes we must walk through shadows to see where the light truly shines. Mrs. Peterson looked down ashamed. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and said, Mary, we owe you an apology. I said, you don't owe me anything, sir. Life has a way of teaching lessons better than any words could. He said, still uneasy, I suppose we misjudged you. I smiled softly and said, that's all right, we all do that. Sometimes the important thing is to learn from it. Clara came forward and hugged me tightly. She whispered, thank you for showing me what real grace looks like. I held her close and said, always remember, dear, dignity is not something anyone gives you, it's something you carry inside. As we were leaving, Mrs. Peterson walked me to the door. She spoke quietly. Mary, you are a remarkable woman. I feel foolish for how I acted. I said we all learn at our own pace. She nodded slowly and said, I see now why Michael admires you so much. That night, as I sat by my window, the moonlight spilling across my floor, I Auntie, a strange peace I had not felt in years. I thought about how easily people are blinded by appearances and how often strength hides behind simplicity. The truth was never about showing wealth. The next morning, it was about everything felt calm for the first time. But little did I know that one more test was coming, a cup of tea, would shake not and just sat by the window, but their understanding of what love and family truly mean. It felt like peace had finally settled into my heart. Michael called and said, Mom, I can't thank you enough for yesterday. You handled everything with so much grace. Clara told me her parents have been quiet all morning. They're embarrassed, but I think they finally understand. I smiled and said, sometimes silence is the beginning of wisdom, dear. He chuckled softly and said, I love you, Mom. I said, I love you too, my son. A few days later, Clara's parents invited me to lunch. It surprised me, but I went with an open heart. When I arrived, Mrs. Peterson looked different, softer, more human. Somehow she greeted me warmly and said, Mary, thank you for coming. I wanted to speak to you privately. We sat in the garden with a gentle breeze blowing through the roses. She said, I've been thinking a lot about how I acted. I'm ashamed of my words. I let pride blind me. To your goodness, I said softly. Pride is a heavy curtain, dear. It blocks the view until life tears it down. She smiled sadly and said, I needed that tear to see clearly. She reached across the table and touched my hand. Mary, I hope you can forgive me. I looked at her and said, of course, dear, forgiveness is easier than anger. It's peace we give ourselves. She took a deep breath and said, You know, I grew up poor too, but I married into wealth and I spent so many years pretending to be someone else. I guess I forgot who I used to be. That honesty touched me more than any apology could I said. It's never too late to remember the woman you once were. From that day on, something changed between us. We didn't become best friends overnight, but there was respect now, real respect, the kind that doesn't need words. Clara noticed it too. She smiled more often. She started visiting me regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes with Michael. We would cook simple meals, talk about wedding plans, and laugh like old friends. But Jay, when life started feeling peaceful again, a storm came one afternoon. Michael called me, his voice shaking. Mom, Clara fainted at work. They rushed her to the hospital. My heart stopped. I grabbed my coat and rushed out without thinking. When I reached the hospital, Michael was pacing outside the emergency room. His eyes were red with worry. He said, "They think it's her heart, Mom. She's been stressed lately." I held his hand and said, "She'll be all right, dear. Have faith." Hours passed before the doctor came out. He said, "Clara is stable now, but she needs rest and less emotional strain." Michael sat by her side for hours. I watched him holding her hand, whispering softly. I saw love pure and trembling in his eyes, and I prayed silently for her recovery. A few days later, Clara was allowed to come home. I insisted she stay at my place for a while, where it was quiet. She hesitated at first, but I told her gently, "This house heals hearts, dear. It has seen worse storms." She smiled weakly and agreed. During those days, I took care of her cooked soup, sat by her bed, and told her stories from my younger days. Sometimes she would wake in the night with tears in her eyes and say, "Mary, I feel so guilty for everything my family said." I said, "Don't carry guilt. Dear, carry gratitude. You are here, you are healing, and that's what matters." She would squeeze my hand and whisper, "You have such strength. I wish I had half of it." I smiled and said, "You already do. It's just sleeping inside, waiting to rise." One evening, Mrs. Peterson came to visit. She looked humbled, holding a basket of fruit. She sat beside Clara's bed and took her hand. For the first time, I saw real tears in her eyes. She said, "My dear, I almost lost you, and it made me realize how foolish I've been. None of the things I worried about really matter. Family, love, kindness. That's what lasts." Clara smiled faintly and said, "I love you, Mom." Mrs. Peterson turned to me and said, "Mary, thank you for being there for her." I said softly, "We are mothers, dear. It's what we do even when it hurts." The days that followed brought a quiet closeness between all of us. Even Mr. Peterson changed. He started dropping by, sometimes with groceries, saying, "I thought you might need these." He wasn't great with words, but actions spoke enough. When Clara finally recovered completely, she said, "Mary, I've been thinking I want a small wedding, something simple with meaning, not a big show." I said, "That sounds perfect. Dear love doesn't need a stage to shine." She smiled and said, "You'll sit next to me, right?" I said, "Always." As I watched her getting stronger each day, I realized that sometimes life uses pain to soften hearts and bring people closer. The woman who once judged me now sat in my kitchen helping me fold napkins and laughing like an old friend, and the young woman who once looked nervous around me now called me Mom. But I didn't know that fate still had one more twist waiting, a final moment that would test not money or pride but pure love itself, and it would remind all of us what true courage really means. A few months passed and peace had finally returned to our lives. Clara's health was better. The wedding was just a few weeks away, and everyone seemed to have settled into a kind of calm joy. I often sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sun sink behind the hills and thinking about how far we had all come. There was a time when pride and misunderstanding filled every conversation, but now there was laughter in its place. It felt like a blessing. One afternoon, Michael stopped by after work. He looked tired but happy. He said, "Mom, I got a promotion today." I smiled proudly and said, "You deserve it, dear. Hard work always pays off." He said, "Clara and I want to start saving for a house after the wedding. We want to do it on our own." I nodded and said, "That's the best way, dear. Build your roots together, piece by piece." A few days later, Clara invited me to her parents' house for dinner. They wanted to thank me for everything and celebrate the upcoming wedding. When I arrived, the house felt different, warmer, more human. Mrs. Peterson greeted me with a genuine smile. Mr. Peterson shook my hand with real respect. For the first time, I felt not like an outsider, but like family. During dinner, we talked easily about small things. Clara's dress, the guest list, the weather. Mrs. Peterson even laughed at one of my old stories about fixing a broken pipe with a hairpin. Everyone seemed at peace, but just as dessert was served, the phone rang. Mr. Peterson went to answer it. When he came back, his face was pale. He said quietly, "There's been a problem at my company. The investment we made last year collapsed. We've lost almost everything." Mrs. Peterson gasped. Clara froze. Michael stood up, instantly asking if there was anything he could do. Mr. Peterson sat down heavily. He said, "It's bad, really bad. We could lose the house too." I could see his hands shaking. Mrs. Peterson was speechless, her eyes full of fear. I felt a wave of sympathy, not judgment. I knew that kind of helplessness. I had lived it once long ago. Michael said firmly, "We'll help you, sir. We'll find a way." Mr. Peterson looked at him with tears in his eyes and said, "I can't ask you for that, son. You're just starting your own life." I said softly, "Sometimes life doesn't ask. It just gives us a chance to do what's right." That night after I went home, I sat quietly thinking. I knew what I had to do the next morning. I called my lawyer and arranged something simple but important. I transferred a part of my savings to help them save their house. I didn't tell them right away. I wanted it done quietly, without pride, without show. A week later, Mrs. Peterson came to my door, her eyes full of tears. She said, "Mary, what did you do?" The bank called and said, "An anonymous payment cleared the debt." I said, "I just did what any mother would do." She started crying and said, "You saved us. You saved our home." I took her hands and said, "No, dear, you saved yourself when you opened your heart. That's what mattered most." She hugged me tightly and whispered, "You've changed me, Mary. I used to think wealth, insecurity, but now I know real wealth is kindness." I smiled and said, "That's the only kind worth keeping." After that day, our bond grew stronger. Clara's parents began to visit often, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just sitting for tea. Mrs. Peterson would help me water the garden and talk about life. She told me how she used to feel trapped by appearances, always worried about what people thought. I said, "That's the saddest kind of prison, dear." And she nodded with tears in her eyes. Finally, the wedding day arrived. It was simple and beautiful, held in a small garden filled with wildflowers. Clara wore a light gown, and Michael couldn't stop smiling as I watched them exchange vows. I felt tears in my eyes, but they were tears of peace. During the reception, Mrs. Peterson took the microphone. She said quietly, "I want to thank someone special today. A woman who taught me that dignity is greater than pride and love is richer than gold. Mary, you are the kind of person who changes hearts without ever raise." In your voice. The guests clapped softly, and I felt my heart swell, not with pride, but with gratitude. After everything that had happened, I realized something powerful. Sometimes pretending to be less than you are is not weakness. It's wisdom. It shows you who deserves your truth and who only sees the surface. When the night ended, Clara hugged me and said, "Mary, you're not just my mother-in-law, you're my hero." I smiled and said, "No, dear, I'm just a woman who believes that kindness always finds its way home." As the stars shimmered above us, I whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. Life had tested us all, but in the end, love had won, without shouting, without fighting, simply by standing still and being true. After the wedding, life moved forward like a calm river. Clara and Michael settled into a small, cozy house not far from mine. They wanted to build their life from scratch together. Just as they had promised, I helped them move in, unpack boxes, and hang pictures on the walls. Each corner of their new home was filled with hope and quiet joy, the kind of peace that doesn't shout, that whispers softly in the evenings when the lights are low and hearts are content. Clara started a new job at a local community center, helping families with financial planning. She said she wanted to use her time to help others avoid the mistakes her own parents had made. She often told me, "Mary, you opened my eyes to what truly matters. I used to think success meant how people saw you. Now I know it's how you make people feel." I smiled and said, "That's the kind of wisdom no school teaches, dear. Only life does. Michael was working harder than ever at his firm, but he never let his ambition distance him from home. He made sure to be there for dinner every night and called me every morning just to say, "Good day, Mom." Sometimes I would see them walking together in the park, hand in hand, laughing softly, and I would thank God for the peace that had finally found them. One afternoon, Mrs. Peterson came to visit me alone. She looked brighter than I had ever seen her. Her clothes were simple, her smile real. She said, "Mary, I've been volunteering at the shelter in town. I finally feel like I'm doing something that matters." I said, "That's beautiful, dear. Giving back always fills the emptiness that money never could." She nodded and said, "I wish I had learned this sooner." I smiled and said, "It's never too late to start being who you were meant to be." We sat in the garden for hours, drinking tea and watching the birds. She said, "You know, I used to envy people who had more. Now I envy those who have peace." I looked at her and said, "Peace doesn't come from what we own, it comes from what we let go." She smiled softly and said, "You're right as always." Months passed and life continued gently. Then one day I received a call from Clara. She sounded emotional. She said, "Mary, I have news. You're going to be a grandmother." I felt tears in my eyes, joy bursting through my heart. I said, "Oh, my dear, that's the best news I've ever heard." She laughed and said, "You'll spoil this baby, won't you?" I said, "That's the only job I plan to take seriously." When the baby was born, a little girl, they named her Grace. I held her in my arms for the first time and felt something holy in that moment. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine and I whispered softly, "You come from a line of strong hearts, my dear, and one day you'll carry that strength in your own quiet way." As Grace grew older, she became my little shadow. She followed me everywhere, in the garden, in the kitchen. Even when I sat reading my old books, she loved hearing stories from my past, and I would tell her gently about courage and kindness, about seeing people not for what they have, but for who they are. Sometimes she would look up at me with her big eyes and say, "Grandma, tell me the one where you met Mommy's parents again." I would laugh and say, "One day when you're older, you'll understand that story a little better." Years went by and life gave us its fair share of storms and sunshine, but through it all, love held us together. Are stronger than ever. Mr. Peterson retired and moved closer to us. He and Mrs. Peterson became different people, kinder, softer. They would host small dinners now with simple food and big hearts. Mrs. Peterson would sometimes take my hand across the table and whisper, "Mary, thank you for forgiving me." I would smile and say, "Forgiveness is like sunlight, dear. It warms everyone it touches." One evening, as we all sat together watching Grace play in the yard, Clara looked at me and said, "Mary, you changed our family forever. You didn't just teach us kindness, you lived it." I said softly, "Love, dear, isn't taught, it's shown." She smiled and said, "I see that now." As the night grew darker and the stars began to appear, I looked around the table at the faces I once thought would never understand me, and I felt nothing but peace. I thought about that first dinner years ago when I sat quietly being judged for my plain dress and simple words. I had acted poor, but in truth, I had been richer than anyone there because I had love, faith, and patience. Now sitting there surrounded by laughter, by unity, by healing, I realized that the greatest wealth we can ever give to the world is the goodness that stays even when no one is watching. The years moved gently like pages turning in a book. I often sat on my porch in the evenings, wrapped in a light shawl, watching. The sun melt into shades of gold, and pink rays would sometimes run across the yard, her laughter echoing through the quiet air. Michael and Clara would wave from their home down the street. It was in those small moments that I realized what peace truly meant. One afternoon, Grace came running up the steps with a wildflower in her hand. She said, "Grandma, this flower is for you." I asked her, "Why did you pick it for me, dear?" She said, "Because it was growing all alone by the fence, and it looked brave." I smiled and said, "Then it's the perfect flower for this house." She climbed onto my lap and rested her head against my shoulder. I looked at her and thought of how life has a way of coming full circle. When I was younger, I thought courage meant fighting loud battles, proving your worth to the world. But as I grew older, I learned that real courage is quieter. It's waking up every morning with kindness in your heart, even after life has hurt you. It's forgiving when you have every reason not to, and it's staying humble even when you could show the world your power. One evening, Clara sat beside me on the porch and said softly, "Mary, sometimes I wonder how you stayed so calm back then when my parents judged you, when everyone thought you had nothing." I looked at her and said, "Because I knew who I was, dear. When you know your worth, no one can make you feel small." She nodded slowly and said, "You were testing us, weren't you?" I smiled and said, "Maybe a little, but mostly I was teaching without saying a word." She laughed through her tears and said, "You changed us all, you made us better." I said I didn't change you. Dear life, did I just stood still long enough for you to see what really mattered? Later that night, I sat alone looking at the stars. The world was quiet and my heart was full. I thought about my husband on many years now and whispered softly, "You'd be proud of them, love. They finally learned what real wealth is." I imagined his smile somewhere in the distance and felt peace. As time went on, Grace grew older, full of curiosity and warmth. She loved to visit me after school. She'd sit at the kitchen table eating cookies and asking questions about the past. One day she asked Grandma, "Why do people pretend to be rich?" I said, "Because sometimes they forget that love is the only thing you can't buy." She thought for a moment, then said, "I want to be like you. When I grow up, I want to be kind." I smiled and said, "Then you'll be the richest girl in the world." When my health began to slow me down, I moved into Michael and Clara's house. They took care of me with so much love that it filled every corner of my days. Clara would bring me tea every morning and say, "You've done enough, Mary, it's our turn now," and I would smile knowing that love had done what time could not. It had healed every old wound and turned judgment into gratitude. One night I sat by the window listening to the sound of rain. Grace came to sit beside me. She was a teenager, now taller than before, but still the same bright soul. She said, "Grandma, tell me again about the day you met Mommy's parents." I laughed softly and said, "Oh, that story never gets old, does it, dear?" She smiled and said, "It's my favorite one." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you won by being kind." Her words filled my eyes with tears. I placed my hand on hers and said, "Remember that always, dear, in this world. You don't have to shout to be strong. Sometimes all you need is to stay kind and let life reveal the truth on its own." As the rain continued to fall softly outside, I closed my eyes and felt a deep calm wash over me. My story was never about money or pride. It was about love, about choosing grace when the world expected bitterness, and about showing that sometimes the quietest hearts carry the loudest lessons. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: you can lose everything and still have everything. If your heart stays kind, you can walk into a room where no one values you and still shine, because real worth doesn't need an audience. And so as I sit here tonight, watching the last drops of rain slide down the window, I whisper one more prayer of thanks. Thank you for the storms that shaped me, for the love that healed me, and for the courage that never left me. Because in the end, pretending to be poor taught me what true richness feels like, and it had nothing to do with money. It was about faith, forgiveness, and the kind of strength that whispers instead of shouts. And that, dear one, is the story of how a simple act of humility turned strangers into family and pride into peace. As I look back on my life now, I realize that everything I went through was leading me here to this peace. I didn't understand it then, but every moment of pain and every small seed of kindness was shaping something beautiful inside me. I remember the day when I first walked into Clara's parents' home, dressed, simply speaking, gently pretending to be less than what I was. They thought they were testing me. But in truth, life was testing them. Sometimes we are placed in situations where our worth is invisible to others, and it hurts deeply. But over time, I learned that real value doesn't need to be seen to exist. It shines quietly through our actions, through how we love, how we forgive, and how we keep standing when life pushes us down. There were days when I cried silently at night, wondering if kindness was enough in a world that sometimes rewards pride more than patience, but I kept believing that love would find its way, and it did, slowly, quietly, like morning light entering a dark room. The years taught me something precious. You don't need to prove yourself to anyone who doesn't see your heart. Time has a way of revealing truth, and grace has a way of healing even the deep sting wounds. When I see Clara now, I see a woman who has learned to lead with kindness. When I see Mrs. Peterson, I see someone who once looked down on others, but now spends her days lifting them up. And when I see Grace, my sweet granddaughter, I see hope for the next generation, a hope that kindness will never go out of style, that empathy will always matter, and that quiet strength will always be more powerful than loud pride. Life isn't perfect, and it never was meant to be. We all stumble, we all hurt, and we all change. But what truly defines us is how we respond. Do we grow bitter or do we grow gentle? Do we close our hearts or open them wider? Sometimes people will mistake your softness for weakness. But the truth is, gentle souls carry the strongest hearts because it takes courage to stay kind. When the world is unkind, it takes faith to keep believing in goodness when you've seen so much pain. I've learned that humility isn't about pretending to be less. It's about knowing you are enough without have. To show it, it's about standing tall in silence and letting love speak louder than words. As the days grow slower now, I find joy in the smallest things. The sound of Grace's laughter, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sight of the sun spilling over the hills. Each little moment is a blessing, and I hold them close like treasures. I sometimes think back to that dinner table long ago when they judged me for being plain and poor, and I smile, not with bitterness but with understanding, because I know now that people act from what they know, and sometimes they simply haven't learned yet what truly matters. I forgave them not because they asked for it, but because I needed peace. Forgiveness is like letting light into a dark room. It doesn't change what happened, but it changes how you see it. In the end, I want my story to remind anyone listening that your worth is never measured by what you wear, what you own, or what others say about you. It's measured by your heart, by your honesty, by your willingness to love, even when it's hard. So to the woman sitting somewhere right now feeling unseen, remember this: your kindness is not wasted. Your patience is not weakness. Your love is not foolish. The world may not see your light today, but one day it will, and when it does, it will shine brighter because it was born in silence. And to every person who has ever been judged, misunderstood, or underestimated, keep your head high and your heart soft, because true strength never shouts, it simply endures and keeps giving. As I end my story, I whisper a quiet prayer of gratitude for all the moments that hurt me and all the ones that healed me, for the lessons wrapped in tears and the blessings hidden in waiting. Because life is never just about what we gain, but about who we become while waiting for love to return to us. And that, dear one, is how a woman who once acted poor taught everyone around her the true meaning of being rich in heart. Sometimes life puts us in moments where we have to stay quiet and let our actions speak for us. You might feel invisible, unheard, or even underestimated, but never forget silence doesn't mean weakness, and kindness doesn't mean you're naive. The truth is, the strongest hearts don't need to shout. They keep loving, they keep forgiving, they keep believing that goodness will win in the end. You see, the woman in this story didn't raise her voice, she raised her grace. She didn't fight back with anger, she chose patience, and that's what made her truly powerful. So if today you feel like no one understands your worth, remember this: God sees it, the right people will see it too in time. Don't let the bitterness of others steal your gentleness, because your light is meant to shine. Even when the world around you goes dark, keep your heart kind, keep your spirit humble, and trust that one day everything that was meant to hurt you will turn into something that heals you. Because sometimes the quietest souls write the loudest stories of courage and love.